Judge Michael Thompson had seen it all during his 23 years on the bench, but nothing quite prepared him for the evening when flames consumed his modest suburban home on Maple Street. The irony would reveal itself 7 days later when the woman responsible for destroying everything he owned would stride confidently into his courtroom, expecting justice to favor her cause. The trouble began 18 months earlier when Michael purchased the 2-story colonial house in the planned community of Willowbrook Estates. After his divorce from Patricia, he needed a fresh start somewhere, quiet where he could focus on his demanding career and perhaps find some peace. The neighborhood seemed perfect with its manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and strict homeowners association rules that promised to maintain property values and community standards. What Michael did not anticipate was encountering Linda Morrison, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood perfection, who served as president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Linda was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair, designer clothes, and an obsession with maintaining what she called community excellence that bordered on fanatical from the moment. Michael moved in. Linda made her presence known. She appeared at his door on the second day with a thick binder containing HOA regulations printed on expensive cream-colored paper. Her smile was as artificial as her nail polish when she explained that every resident was expected to maintain their property according to strict guidelines that she personally enforced. The first violation notice arrived 3 weeks after he moved in. According to Linda, his mailbox was 2 inches too tall and needed to be adjusted immediately to comply with HOA standards. Michael found the complaint ridiculous, but complied to avoid unnecessary conflict. He was a busy man with a full docket of cases to review and had little time for petty neighborhood disputes. The second notice came because his garbage cans remained visible from the street for more than 4 hours after pickup. The third was for parking his sedan in the driveway instead of the garage. Each violation carried a $50 fine that Michael paid without argument, despite finding the rules increasingly absurd. Linda seemed to take his compliance as encouragement rather than resolution. She began patrolling the neighborhood daily, armed with a measuring tape camera and citation book. Her targets were not random, but Michael noticed that certain residents received more attention than others. The elderly couple at the end of the street never seemed to get citations, despite their overgrown garden, while the young family with 2 small children received weekly notices for various infractions. The pattern became clear when Michael observed Linda during one of her inspection rounds. She moved through the neighborhood like a general surveying her domain, stopping to photograph minor imperfections that she would later transform into official violations. Her focus seemed particularly intense when she reached his property, where she would spend several minutes examining every detail from the height of his grass to the position of his outdoor furniture. Michael began to suspect that Linda had singled him out for special attention. Perhaps she resented having a judge in the neighborhood, someone who understood the law better than she did and might challenge her authority. Or maybe she simply enjoyed exercising power over others, regardless of their position in the community. The breaking point came during a particularly contentious HOA meeting in early autumn. Michael had attended, hoping to address the increasingly frequent citations he was receiving for what seemed like arbitrary violations. The meeting was held in the community center, a sterile room with fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable folding chairs arranged in precise rows. Linda presided over the meeting with the authority of a Supreme Court justice, announcing new regulations and discussing violation statistics with obvious pride. When Michael raised his hand to speak, her expression immediately hardened. "Judge Thompson," she said in a voice that could freeze water, "I believe you have some concerns about our community standards." Michael stood and addressed the small group of residents who attended these monthly gatherings. He explained that he supported reasonable regulations that protected property values, but felt that some recent citations were excessive and potentially arbitrary. He cited specific examples, including a violation for having his newspaper delivered to his doorstep instead of the mailbox, and another for displaying his house number in a font that was deemed inappropriate. Linda listened with growing irritation, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the table. When Michael finished speaking, she rose from her chair with theatrical indignation. Judge Thompson, she declared, our community standards are what make Willowbrook Estates a desirable place to live. If you find our regulations burdensome, perhaps, you should consider whether this neighborhood is right for someone of your particular perspective, though. Room fell silent as other residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Michael realized that Linda had just issued a veiled threat disguised as a suggestion. She was telling him to conform or leave, and doing so in front of witnesses who would remember this. Confrontation. Michael remained calm, drawing on years of courtroom experience dealing with hostile attorneys and difficult defendants. He simply stated that he intended to continue living in his home and following reasonable regulations while challenging those that seemed arbitrary or excessive. Linda smiled, but her eyes remained cold. "We shall see, Judge Thompson," she said, settling back into her chair. "We shall certainly see." The escalation began immediately. Within a week, Michael received 4 separate violation notices for infractions that seemed increasingly petty. Was positioned incorrectly, according to Linda. His porch light bulb was too bright and created glare that disturbed neighbors. His car remained in the driveway for more than the permitted time limit during a weekend when he was working at home. Each citation came with a $50 fine, a stern warning that continued violations could result in additional penalties, including liens against his property. Michael realized that Linda was conducting a campaign of harassment, designed to make his life miserable and force him to either comply completely with her every demand or abandon his home. He began documenting every citation, photographing the alleged violations, and researching the legal basis for each complaint. What he discovered was that many of Linda's regulations exceeded the authority granted to homeowners associations under state law. Some were entirely fabricated rules that appeared nowhere in the original HOA documents he had signed when purchasing his home. Michael decided to fight back, using his legal expertise to challenge Linda's authority. He began by requesting copies of all HOA documents, including the original covenants, bylaws, and any amendments that had been legally adopted by the community. What he found was shocking. Linda had been creating and enforcing rules that had never been properly voted on by the Homeowners Association. Many of her most stringent regulations were personal preferences that she had elevated to the status of community law without following proper procedures. She was operating as a dictator rather than an elected representative of the community. Armed with this information, Michael prepared a comprehensive legal challenge to Linda's authority. He drafted a letter outlining the illegal nature of many HOA regulations and demanding that improperly adopted rules be rescinded. He also requested a special meeting of all homeowners to discuss reforming the association's governance structure. Linda's response was swift and vicious. She began issuing daily violation notices for increasingly absurd infractions. Michael's grass was allegedly too green, suggesting excessive watering that violated drought restrictions. His car was parked at an improper angle in his own driveway. His outdoor thermometer was mounted in a location that created visual pollution. The fines accumulated rapidly, reaching nearly $2,000 within a month. Linda also began threatening legal action to place lien on Michael's property if the violations were not corrected and the fines paid immediately. Other neighbors began approaching Michael, privately expressing support for his challenge to Linda's authority but fear of becoming targets themselves if they spoke publicly. He learned that Linda had been terrorizing the community for years, driving away residents who dared to question her methods and surrounding herself with a small group of supporters who benefited from her protection. The situation reached a crisis point when Linda declared that Michael's front yard landscaping violated multiple HOA regulations and needed to be completely redone according to her specifications. The cost would exceed $15,000 and the work would need to be completed by an approved contractor within 30 days or face additional penalties. Michael knew that Linda was attempting to force him into bankruptcy or abandonment of his home. The demanded landscaping changes were unnecessary, expensive, and designed purely to punish him for challenging her authority. He decided that the time had come for decisive legal action. He filed a lawsuit against the Homeowners Association challenging the validity of numerous regulations and seeking damages for harassment and abuse of authority. The lawsuit named Linda personally, as well as the HOA board members who had enabled her behavior. He also filed complaints with state regulators responsible for overseeing homeowners associations. Linda's reaction to the lawsuit was explosive. She called an emergency HOA meeting and declared that Michael Thompson was a threat to community safety and property values. She proposed new regulations that would specifically target his property and lifestyle while claiming they were necessary for the protection of all residents. The meeting drew the largest attendance in years as neighbors came to witness the confrontation between their tyrannical HOA president and the judge who dared to challenge her authority. Michael presented his case calmly and methodically, explaining how Linda had exceeded her authority and violated state laws governing homeowners associations. Linda responded with increasingly hysterical accusations, claiming that Michael was using his position as a judge to intimidate honest community volunteers and undermine legitimate regulations. She painted herself as a victim of judicial abuse and called on residents to support her against what she termed legal bullying. The community was divided, but Michael sensed that many residents were beginning to question Linda's methods, even if they were afraid to speak openly. Several homeowners approached him after the meeting, expressing support for his lawsuit and sharing their own stories of harassment and excessive fines. Winter arrived early that year, bringing cold temperatures and the first significant snowfall in November. Michael found some peace in the quiet months when Linda's patrol activities were limited by weather conditions. He used the time to strengthen his legal case, gathering additional evidence of HOA overreach and building support among neighbors who had suffered under Linda's regime. The temporary calm ended abruptly in early spring when Linda resumed her aggressive enforcement campaign with renewed intensity. She seemed determined to escalate the conflict beyond property violations into personal warfare designed to destroy Michael's life and career. She began filing complaints against Michael with the State Judicial Ethics Commission, claiming that his lawsuit against the HOA represented a conflict of interest and abuse of his judicial position. The complaints were frivolous and ultimately dismissed, but they created stress and distraction that interfered with his professional duties. Linda also started spreading rumors throughout the community, suggesting that Michael was unstable, dangerous, and unsuitable for his judicial position. She told neighbors that judges should not be allowed to live in residential communities because they brought criminal elements and security risks to peaceful neighborhoods. The harassment campaign expanded to include Michael's professional life when Linda began appearing at the courthouse during his lunch breaks, attempting to confront him about HOA matters in front of colleagues and court staff. Security personnel were forced to escort her from the building on several occasions, but she always returned with new grievances and demands. Michael realized that Linda had moved beyond simple neighborhood disputes into a campaign of personal destruction. She seemed willing to risk her own reputation and legal liability to drive him from the community and punish him for challenging her authority. The situation spiraled completely out of control on a warm evening in late May. Michael had worked late at the courthouse, reviewing cases for the following day's docket, and arrived home around 9 o'clock to find Linda standing in his front yard holding what appeared to be a gasoline can. She was not alone. 3 other HOA board members stood nearby, along with several residents who supported Linda's leadership. They had positioned themselves around Michael's property in what looked like a coordinated demonstration or protest. When Michael stepped out of his car, Linda began shouting accusations about his failure to comply with landscaping regulations and his abuse of legal processes, to harass volunteer community leaders. Her voice was shrill and her behavior increasingly erratic as she waved the gasoline can in the air. Michael remained calm and asked the group to leave his property immediately. He warned them that they were trespassing, and that continued harassment could result in criminal charges and restraining orders. Linda's response was to pour gasoline from the can onto Michael's carefully maintained front garden, while screaming about property values and community standards. The other protesters seemed shocked by her actions and began backing away as the situation escalated beyond their comfort level. Michael immediately called 911 and retreated to his front porch while keeping Linda and her supporters in sight. He could smell the gasoline fumes and realized that Linda had created an extremely dangerous situation that could result in serious injury or property damage. The police arrived within minutes, but Linda had disappeared along with most of her supporters. Only 2 HOA board members remained, and they claimed they had no knowledge of Linda's intentions or the gasoline incident. The responding officers took a report, but noted that, without witnesses or physical evidence, it would be difficult to pursue charges. Michael spent the next several days installing security cameras around his property and documenting the gasoline incident for his ongoing lawsuit. He also filed for a restraining order against Linda, citing harassment, escalating behavior, and threats to his safety and property. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following month, but Linda failed to appear in court. Her attorney claimed she was out of town visiting family and requested a continuance. Michael's attorney objected, noting Linda's pattern of escalating harassment and the potential danger to his client and the community. The judge granted a temporary restraining order requiring Linda to stay away from Michael's property, cease all contact with him outside of official HOA business conducted through attorneys. The order also prohibited her from filing frivolous complaints or engaging in harassment campaigns. Linda's response to the restraining order was to increase her activities while technically staying within legal boundaries. She organized neighborhood watch patrols that focused exclusively on Michael's property and encouraged residents to report any suspicious activities or code violations they observed. She also began a letter-writing campaign targeting Michael's judicial superiors, claiming that his lawsuit against the HOA demonstrated poor judgment and unfitness for his position. The letters contained wild accusations and conspiracy theories, but they created additional stress and scrutiny that interfered with his work. Summer brought new challenges as Linda escalated her campaign of harassment while staying just within legal limits. She organized community events specifically scheduled to disrupt Michael's quiet enjoyment of his property, including early morning exercise classes in the park across from his home and evening social gatherings that lasted until midnight. Michael documented each incident and consulted with his attorney about additional legal remedies. The harassment was clearly coordinated and designed to make his life miserable, but Linda was careful to avoid direct violations of the restraining order that would result in immediate consequences. The final escalation came on a sweltering evening in August when Michael returned home from a particularly difficult day in court involving a high-profile murder trial. He was exhausted and looking forward to a quiet evening at home when he noticed smoke rising from his backyard. Racing around the side of his house, Michael discovered that someone had set fire to his wooden deck and the flames were spreading toward the main structure. He immediately called the fire department while using his garden hose to try to contain the blaze, but the fire had already gained significant momentum. Within minutes, the flames had engulfed the rear of his house and were climbing toward the second floor where his bedroom and home office were located. The fire department arrived quickly, but the damage was already extensive and spreading rapidly through the old wooden structure. Michael stood in his front yard, watching 23 years of memories and possessions disappear into smoke and flame. Photo albums from his marriage, legal documents, personal mementos, and furniture that had belonged to his grandparents were all being consumed by the inferno. The fire chief approached Michael as firefighters continued battling the blaze that had now consumed most of his home. Initial investigations suggested that the fire had been deliberately set using an accelerant, possibly gasoline, that created the rapid spread and intense heat that made the house unsalvable. As Michael watched his home burn to the ground, he noticed Linda Morrison standing across the street with several other residents observing the destruction. Her expression was not one of sympathy or concern, but rather satisfaction, as if she were witnessing the successful completion of a long-planned project. When the fire was finally extinguished 4 hours later, nothing remained but charred timbers, twisted metal, and the acrid smell of smoke that would linger in the neighborhood for days. Michael had lost everything except the clothes he was wearing. In the briefcase in his car containing court documents, the fire investigation began immediately with arson specialists examining the debris for evidence of deliberate ignition. They found clear signs that accelerant had been used to start the fire, that the ignition points were consistent with intentional rather than accidental causes. Michael provided investigators with detailed information about his ongoing dispute with Linda Morrison, including the previous gasoline incident and her escalating pattern of harassment. He also shared security camera footage from neighboring houses that showed suspicious activity around his property on the evening of the fire. While investigators worked to build their case, Michael faced the immediate challenge of finding temporary housing, and replacing essential items needed for his professional duties. Several colleagues offered assistance, and he eventually secured a furnished apartment near the courthouse, while insurance adjusters assessed his loss. The investigation took several weeks, but eventually yielded sufficient evidence to support arson charges. Security cameras had captured Linda Morrison approaching Michael's property around midnight on the night of the fire, carrying what appeared to be the same type of gasoline can she had displayed during the previous confrontation. Additional evidence included gasoline, residue on clothing found in Linda's trash, and testimony from witnesses who had heard her making threats about teaching Michael Thompson a lesson he would never forget. The case was solid, but Michael faced the unusual situation of being both victim and potential judge in the legal proceedings. Linda was arrested on charges of first-degree arson, criminal mischief, harassment, and violation of the restraining order. Her arrest came as a shock to many in the community who had supported her leadership of the HOA, but had never imagined she would resort to criminal destruction of property. The arrest warrant was served early on a Tuesday morning as Linda was leaving her home for her regular neighborhood patrol. Neighbors watched in amazement as police officers handcuffed the woman, who had terrorized their community for years, and led her away in the back of a patrol car. Linda's initial court appearance was scheduled for the following Tuesday, in the very courthouse where Michael Thompson presided over his own docket of cases. The irony was not lost on anyone involved in the case, including the court administrators, who faced the challenge of ensuring appropriate judicial assignment. Michael recused himself from any direct involvement in Linda's case, but the scheduling meant that she would appear in the same building where he worked every day. The victim and the accused would occupy the same space, seeking justice from a system that Michael had served faithfully for more than 2 decades. The morning of Linda's arraignment, Michael was in his chambers, reviewing cases when his clerk informed him that the woman who had burned down his house was being processed in the courthouse jail just 2 floors below his office. The surreal nature of the situation was not lost on him as he prepared for his own docket while the person who had destroyed his life waited in custody. Linda Morrison was led into courtroom 3 wearing an orange jail jumpsuit and shackles, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled, and her designer clothes replaced with the standard attire of criminal defendants. She looked smaller and more vulnerable than she had during her reign of terror in Willowbrook Estates. Judge Patricia Williams presided over the arraignment, reading the charges against Linda while court reporters documented every word of the proceedings. Linda stood with her public defender as the prosecutor outlined the evidence against her, including security camera footage, gasoline residue, and witness testimony. The charges were serious, carrying potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison if Linda were convicted on all counts. First-degree arson was a felony that reflected the deliberate and dangerous nature of her actions, while the harassment and restraining order violations demonstrated a pattern of escalating criminal behavior. Linda entered a plea of not guilty through her attorney, who argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that his client had been the victim of a campaign of legal harassment by a powerful judge who had abused his position to persecute a volunteer community leader. The prosecutor responded by detailing the extensive evidence against Linda, including her documented pattern of harassment, the previous gasoline incident, and the clear motive of revenge against Michael Thompson for challenging her authority in the homeowners association. Judge Williams set bail at $50,000 and scheduled a preliminary hearing for the following month. Linda's family posted bond and she was released pending trial, but remained subject to the existing restraining order that prohibited contact with Michael Thompson. The case attracted significant media attention, as reporters discovered the unusual circumstances of a HOA president being charged with burning down a judge's house. The story highlighted broader issues about homeowners association abuse of power, and the lengths to which some people would go to maintain control over their communities. Michael found himself in the uncomfortable position of being both a victim seeking justice and a public figure, whose personal life had become the subject of news coverage and community gossip. He maintained his professional duties while dealing with the emotional and practical challenges of rebuilding his life after losing everything he owned. The preliminary hearing revealed the full extent of evidence against Linda Morrison, including additional security camera footage that showed her conducting surveillance of Michael's property on multiple occasions leading up to the fire. Gasoline Purchase records linked her to the accelerant used in the arson and cell phone data, placed her in the vicinity at the time of ignition. Linda's defense attorney argued that his client was being prosecuted for legitimate HOA enforcement activities and that the arson charges were based on circumstantial evidence and speculation. He claimed that Michael Thompson had used his judicial influence to pressure investigators into targeting Linda as a scapegoat for what might have been an accidental fire. The judge found probable cause to proceed with the felony charges, noting that substantial evidence of premeditation and the serious nature of Linda's alleged crimes. The case was bound over for trial with a date set for early autumn when both parties present their complete cases to a jury. Michael spent the summer months rebuilding his life while preparing to testify as the primary victim in Linda's trial. He found a new home in a different neighborhood without homeowners, association restrictions, and slowly began replacing possessions that had been destroyed in the fire. The insurance settlement helped financially, but could not restore personal items that held sentimental value, including photographs from his childhood, legal documents from important cases, and furniture that had been in his family for generations. The emotional impact of losing everything was something that money could not address. As the trial date approached, Michael reflected on the bizarre series of events that had led from a simple property dispute to felony arson charges. Linda Morrison's obsession with neighborhood control had cascaded into criminal behavior that would likely result in significant prison time and the complete destruction of her own life. The trial began on a crisp October morning with jury selection in the same courthouse where Michael worked every day. He took leave from his judicial duties to focus on his role as victim and witness. While avoiding any appearance of impropriety or influence over the proceedings, Linda Morrison sat at the defendant's table looking very different from the confident HOA president who had once terrorized Willowbrook Estates. Months of legal stress and public scrutiny had taken their toll, and she appeared fragile and defeated as prosecutors outlined their case against her. The evidence was overwhelming, including security camera footage showing Linda approaching Michael's property with gasoline chemical analysis, confirming arson, and witness testimony about her threats and erratic behavior. The prosecution painted a picture of escalating harassment culminating in deliberate destruction of property. Linda's defense team argued that she had been driven to desperation by what they characterized as judicial bullying and abuse of power. They claimed that Michael Thompson had used his position to harass their client, and that her actions, while inappropriate, were the result of extreme stress and mental anguish. Michael testified about the pattern of harassment he had endured, including excessive HOA citations, frivolous complaints, and escalating threats to his safety and property. He described coming home to find his house in flames and watching everything he owned disappear into smoke and ash. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including first-degree arson, criminal mischief, harassment, and violation of restraining orders. Linda Morrison sat motionless as the verdicts were read, showing no emotion, as her fate was sealed. Judge Williams sentenced Linda to 15 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation and restitution of $200,000 to cover Michael's losses. The sentence reflected the serious nature of her crimes and the need to protect the community from further escalation of her dangerous behavior. As Linda was led away in handcuffs, Michael felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but the entire episode had been a tragic waste that had destroyed 2 lives and traumatized an entire community. The woman who had once wielded power over neighbors was now facing decades in prison for her obsession with control. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association was disbanded following Linda's conviction, as residents voted to eliminate the organization that had enabled her harassment and abuse of authority. Many neighbors apologized to Michael for failing to speak out against Linda's behavior when intervention might have prevented the tragic escalation. Michael returned to his judicial duties with a deeper appreciation for the importance of due process and the dangers of unchecked authority. His experience as a victim had given him new insights into the emotional impact of crime and the challenges faced by those seeking justice in an imperfect system. The new neighborhood where Michael rebuilt his life was very different from Willowbrook. Estates with diverse architecture, relaxed atmosphere, and neighbors who respected privacy while maintaining friendly relationships. There were no homeowners, association restrictions, or self-appointed guardians of community standards to create conflict and tension. Michael's new home was smaller than what he had lost, but it represented a fresh start, free from the memories of harassment and destruction that had defined his final months on Maple Street. He decorated carefully, choosing items that reflected his personality rather than conforming to someone else's vision of appropriate style. The legal victory against Linda Morrison established important precedents for homeowners association, accountability, and the limits of community governance. Michael's case was cited in subsequent lawsuits challenging HOA overreach and helped strengthen protections for residents facing harassment from overzealous enforcement. Years later, Michael would reflect on the lessons learned from his encounter with Linda Morrison and the importance of standing up to bullies, regardless of their position or authority. The woman who had tried to destroy his life had ultimately destroyed her own, while strengthening the legal protections that would help future victims of HOA abuse. The courtroom where Linda Morrison was convicted became a symbol of justice for Michael Thompson, who had lost everything but ultimately prevailed against tyranny and harassment. The woman who had walked confidently into his world expecting special treatment had instead found herself facing the full consequences of her criminal actions. Linda Morrison was now serving her sentence in state prison, where her days were governed by rules and regulations far more restrictive than any she had ever imposed on her former neighbors. The woman who had once terrorized a community with citation books and measuring tapes was learning what it meant to live under truly inflexible authority. Michael Thompson returned to his bench with renewed commitment to justice and fairness, having experienced firsthand what it meant to be a victim seeking protection from a legal system he had served for decades. His encounter with Linda Morrison had tested his faith in justice, but ultimately reinforced his belief in the rule of law and the importance of holding everyone accountable regardless of position or perceived authority. The house on Maple Street was eventually demolished, and the lot remained empty for several years before new construction began. Neighbors would sometimes drive by and remember the judge who had stood up to their tyrannical HOA president and paid the ultimate price for challenging her authority before finally achieving justice in the very courthouse where he had built his career. The Willowbrook Estates community slowly healed from the trauma of Linda Morrison's reign of terror, but residents never forgot the lessons learned about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of speaking out against abuse before it escalates into violence and destruction. Michael Thompson's story became a cautionary tale about homeowners association overreach and the lengths to which some people will go to maintain control over others. But it was also a story of resilience, justice, and the ultimate triumph of law over lawlessness in a system designed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. The woman who had burned his house to the ground thinking she could escape consequences had instead walked into his courtroom, where justice waited patiently to hold her accountable for her crimes. In the end, Linda Morrison discovered that no one is above the law, not even those who appoint themselves as judges of their neighbors' lives and property.